Walk into almost any food safety leadership meeting this year, and AI will come up within the first 10 minutes. Vendors are pitching it, boards are asking about it, the trade press is certainly full of it, and underneath all that energy is a question almost nobody is really answering honestly. Is your organization actually ready to use it? Most probably are not. And the consequences of finding out the hard way after you've signed a contract, rolled out a tool that your data systems can't support, or your culture will not act on is an expensive one at best, and maybe potentially a dangerous one at worst when we're talking about food safety. Dr. Claire Zollner and I spent the last year working on a paper that tries to give food safety professionals a way to answer that question before we spend that money. It's called Food Safe AI, the Food System Assessment Framework for Evaluating AI, and it just published in Food Protection Trends, and there's a free downloadable assessment tool that goes with it. Today, I want to walk through it with my co-author because there are parts of this paper she understands certainly better than I do, and there are parts where I still want to explore what we wrote and talk about what we think is coming next. Claire's Director of Data Science at iFoods DS, where she leads data strategy and product development for food safety and traceability software used across the supply chain. She holds a PhD from Cornell, and her postdoctoral work centered on the Enable model for Listeria environmental monitoring. Claire, welcome.
Hi, Ben. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to have you with us. And it was fun to write that paper together over the last year or so. And, when I think about timing, I think, we submitted it in August and we heard it wouldn't be published until May, and thought, well, that's too long. This is going to move too quickly. And at the same time, I think the timing ended up being good in so much as, there's a lot more out there today in mid 2026 than even there was in around AI and food safety and how people are thinking about using it than when we first submitted it in August of last year. So let's start at the beginning. There's really not any shortage in terms of writing on AI and potential uses in food safety. We didn't write that paper specifically. We decided to focus on a readiness assessment rather than really a catalog of, what AI can do. Why did we take that approach?
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this for a few years. I mean, you've opened up with I got started with building models for food safety a while back and as a postdoc in 2016, 2018, and trying to get those in the hands of food manufacturers, thinking that it was a lack of data is what's holding us back from improving food safety programs. And if we could use simulation and modeling tools to give us more data or richer data, we'd be able to make better decisions, be more preventive. Working at a software company now as well, seeing how it's difficult, right, to start and stop new tech projects for various different reasons that we've kind of summarized in this paper. And so again, I feel like introducing and building these modeling tools and data-based algorithms and new analytical methods like AI ML. Some of it is knowing what the tech can do, but most of operationalizing that is more of a business problem and requires some cross kind of organization initiatives. And so, we can identify all the places it might work and it might have impact in theory or in short pilots. But if we really want to move the needle and show change and improvements, I think that's where we came in. So, okay, we step back. Why are we having trouble implementing these and sustaining these over time? And what are the pieces that maybe we all need to work together more on? Or, is it we got to go back to the drawing board of the piece of technology that's missing. So I think that's kind of how I've over the past few years come to this point of, are you ready for it? What do you need to do? What's a foundation of, starting to think about these tools? And I know your work as well with a lot of organizations, kind of we had a lot of synergies and experience there that you brought to the table of like actual pilots that people are going through. And I think that's where we came together and said, okay, it's more than a paper. Yeah, we want a tool, or we want something tangible that people could kind of assess themselves on,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it was, it usually starts with defining the problem you're trying to solve. I mean, we work at TAG in the consulting space. We don't really work in the IT space per se, but we certainly interface with a lot of those tools. And I think our clients are trying to discover or think about, how do we approach this? What data do we have? How do we use that data to solve problems, maybe in ways that we haven't before? And so, you know, some of it's a technical problem, right? As you talked about, the enable model that you develop, like, I mean, you can come to an interesting technical solution and learn some interesting things along the way, but it's organizationally, is that entity or that company or that site or that unit within that site, do they have sort of all the ingredients in place to be able to kind of move into an environment where you're going to be able to do more with that data, turn it into information. And then I think one of the frameworks that we looked at around automation was a paper from kind of the early 2000s, right, about automation and really kind of what the airline industry went through. But now we're 25 years, a quarter century later, and food safety, we're catching up maybe a little bit. But we thought about kind of organizing that problem, or sort of the framework that we developed, into kind of three pillars, right? We talked about organizational buy-in with a clearly defined business problem. Then what's the IT infrastructure and data acumen within that company, or whatever kind of vertical you're assessing. And then what's the food safety program maturity and agility in that space? So walk the listeners through kind of, why did we land on those three, and kind of why in that order when we created the tool.
Yeah. So again, I think even outside, you mentioned airline industry, right? Other sectors have gone through similar, tech innovation transitions, and food safety is no different, right? If you look in that same span, 25 years, we've gone from paper to digital to cloud-based in food safety, and all that is another piece that's making the food safety domain ready for AI right now. But across all the other sectors, what can we learn from barriers, regardless of where you're applying AI? Is typically still proving business value, obtaining necessary data, managing risks, and making sure you're implementing the right technology. And so again, that's kind of how I bucketed those barriers into kind of three pieces of your business, potentially different teams, but kind of three areas of the business that kind of need to align to get past all of those barriers, and again, kind of sustain a valuable solution over time. And so, yeah, the first one is that organizational kind of alignment from top down, organizational buy-in and having a problem. I like how you started out with that. What's the problem we're trying to solve? And that will really kind of focus the effort and the resources needed. And so again, with that, starting with the first one, it's kind of a problem and a strategy are the key components of this organizational buy-in and business problem. We haven't yet talked about cost, but that's one main reason why you need that alignment, right? This is going to take investment and continued kind of enthusiasm and support across the business. And without that, you likely will start a pilot or start trying to assemble data, start trying to align things, but it'll likely be fleeting effort that kind of gets put on the side with changing priorities or other business objectives. So, maybe, I don't know if you want us to go through the exact questions we included, but in general, this section of the framework is considering, leadership support for AI, for automation, having a problem that's difficult to solve otherwise, that justifies investment in something new that might potentially be disruptive. But it's a high priority problem that's hard to solve otherwise. And so, we're all aligned with investing in a long-term project to solve it. And again, kind of just cross-functional support to productionalize or operationalize that over time. So that was kind of the first area, organizational buy-in and business problem. Again, without that, you just kind of have a fleeting maybe project or pilot that doesn't take off and doesn't materialize over time. The second one is IT support and data acumen. So again, okay, we've got the problem. We got strategy and alignment across the business. Now we're going to start maybe assembling data or looking at our systems or looking at vendors you mentioned. And so really the key point on your technical side is, do you have dedicated IT support, and do you have leadership that we call, data acumen, data literacy, but ability to make good judgments about the use of data to support problems and solutions, right? So if you have data literate decision makers and a dedicated IT team, you're well positioned to initiate projects that are going to require aggregating data across all your facilities or your locations, integrating any new solution with other technologies and workflows that you're using, again, across your business. And the other big barrier here is security risks, right? A lot of companies these days have to be on top of security of their data systems and not introducing new vulnerabilities, and every time you start a new tech project. And so again, that takes a dedicated IT team and business leaders, maybe domain leaders in food safety, for example, that understand the data sources and streams and quality of data that might be used. And the main consequence that we propose of implementing something without having this solid IT support and data acumen is introduction of disparate solutions. So you'll struggle to maintain this over time because it's not integrated, it's not secure, your information is not confidential, or the infrastructure setup requires a lot of IT support that maybe you can't sustain over time. So that's the second area, IT support, data acumen. And then the last one is food safety, maturity, and agility. And this really comes from, okay, we've got this problem we need to solve. We've got all this data. We've got potentially some algorithm or some tool that's going to give us some information about what's going on. And then what can we do about it? Can we do anything different than we're doing today? Would we do anything different if we had different information? I think this is a big one that I learned from Enable, right? We were predicting where listeria is in your facility during production, thinking that would help you modify your environmental monitoring program, maybe assess different capital improvements that you might need in your facility. And what we learned was, yeah, if you don't have the support and the culture, you're not at a point in your food safety program where you could do anything different, then having that data is actually not helpful. And so, there was a quote we included in the paper that kind of inspired how to articulate this, which is, AI, data science are supposed to help you drive better decisions always. But if there's no way for you to change your operation or change how you make decisions, then again, having more information doesn't help you get there. So the questions that we included in the section around food safety maturity are around, do you have, a food safety program, food safety team? Are you in a mindset of continuous improvement? What is your relationship with other players in the supply chain, right? Because some of these tools and some of these proposed applications might actually push interventions upstream of you, for example. And so what would that be like in the supply chain or with your supply chain partners? So again, I think, that was the third section, is around, your food safety team and programs' ability to potentially, be more proactive or address signals that might be new indicators, for example. And again, just kind of enabling that continuous improvement mindset. I don't know, Ben, if you had any other pieces to add to those, but maybe I'll just wrap up with, without that food safety, maturity, and agility, the risk is that you are building kind of irrelevant, or in some cases irresponsible models or solutions, because you actually can't act on the information that's coming out of it. So we have a nice Venn diagram in the article that's kind of showing the intersection of all three of those areas as, valuable AI solution or a tool that you can sustain in your operation over time. And then again, if you're missing one of those, you either have kind of just a fleeting project, or something that's disparate, disconnected actually from other work streams and other operations, or is actually kind of inactionable, irrelevant, or irresponsible if you can't do anything different.
Yeah, that last one's interesting, and we can dig into that one a little bit more, kind of when we get to the specific part around the food safety culture question and sections. But I think one of the things, and we do a lot of work in that space, and just in terms of organizational assessment, not necessarily in the context of AI, but just, right, where am I in terms of my cultural maturity overall when it comes to food safety, and there's a lot of variability depending on, what company you're looking at, or even within a company. So I like that aspect of the framework that we've developed, because I think it calls that question in an important way. And, to your point, and I think we touch on this through another reference in the paper, but it's, if you're creating some of this information and you're unable to do something with it, does that just sort of increase your liability at that point, from a regulatory or just strict liability standpoint? So what strikes me is that, and I'm curious if you've had this experience recently, but I was, one of the food safety conferences recently, and, just conversations on the floor. Are you using AI? How are you thinking about it? Just sort of hanging out, listening to kind of customers or talking, or prospective clients are talking to AI vendors. And more than once I heard, well, our leadership wants us to look at AI, like, and figure out how to use it. So, which I think runs counter, right, to sort of the argument that we're trying to make in this framework. It's like, start with the problem and then go find the solution, rather than just say, well, we're going to start with AI. Let's figure out what AI can do for us, which I think is a valuable question to ask, right? We know it's an emerging technology. In theory, it can drive ROI, right? It can drive efficiency. You can surface new insights, sky's the limit, right? But what I heard more of was, leadership told us we need to do this. We're going to go find a vendor that can sell us, for those watching, I've got air quotes, AI, right? Like, those listening, there are air quotes. But, I think that's a challenge that, not just food safety. I think that's true across all industry segments. But I think when you're talking about, in particular, a regulated sector like food safety, there are regulatory requirements that if you're going to make food, you have to meet, right? And if we're going to make safe food, we have to understand how and why we're making safe food. So sort of bringing an untested, sort of unvalidated technology into the mix without thinking about sort of, again, what's that problem we're trying to solve? What's the question we're trying to answer? I think, to your point, creates some of those risks along that surface. I don't know if you've kind of had similar experiences recently, but it seems like
Yeah, I think going to a few recent meetings and speaking on this topic and then asking, what are you using it for? Are you using it? I think you and I might still agree on you don't need AI to have a strong food safety program, right? And I think we do try to weave that into these questions in the framework. Like if you're in the middle of a massive issue, right, trying to stand up some AI solution, figure out how that, is going to fix an immediate problem you're having, maybe isn't a good business decision or a good practice. And so that's where I think the food safety culture kind of spectrum helps to put where this fits in your food safety, maturity, right? Having that solid program, you're using data, you're updating your SOPs regularly, you review information, and then when you're ready to get predictive and preventive, okay, then you start applying these, which is counter to, okay, we need to just explore a new technology and see if it fits. We've got this hammer, we're looking for a nail. And I think both of those kind of coming at it from both ends maybe is valuable to meet somewhere, land somewhere in the middle that is okay, a good application. There's been some interesting surveys, right, coming out from like big consulting groups or these tech providers of what our CEOs thinking about AI. And as you mentioned, it's everyone wants to be able to speak to how they're using it, because it's like if I don't, a competitor is going to be applying this in a way that's better. I'm going to be left behind, right? And even non-leadership, like boots on the ground employees these days, right? It's like upskill or be replaced kind of thing. So everyone is in general like scrambling to understand how do we interact with AI? How do I use it to improve my value to the business and efficiency at work? And so I think that applies, that's kind of applying at all levels of the business now. And maybe to your point, when we wrote this, we presented this first actually back in 2024, and definitely the landscape looked very different than here we are mid 2026 with these enterprise grade agentic solutions at basically everyone's fingertips. And so I think even though we were worried, yeah, this paper was like kind of started 2 years ago, but it is, I think, even more relevant today because some of those same principles that we're talking about um, are relevant to not even from a leadership perspective, but even for maybe an individual to look through like what is my day-to-day role and responsibility or my team, and how are we ready as this small unit to try out a tool to change our workflow, to change our impact on the food safety program. One data or one piece I'll share from one of those recent, it was actually a Microsoft work trend index report that looked at all the chats in Copilot. What are people using Copilot for example? Pick your tool, and think about what are all the people using it for. And I think in the past, we assume people are using this to maybe get new information, maybe summarize document, write a document. But what they're showing is that the changing trend is people are really using this to analyze information, reason, and make a decision. And I think those are aspects of a task or a process that you really looked into in this framework, right? So we introduce these 3 business areas, but then we analyze the steps maybe where you could incorporate this in actually making a decision. And again, the recent survey or analysis of how people are using these tools is actually moving further down through that stage of choosing the decision and actually implementing the action. And Microsoft argues that this is expanding who can do higher value work in your organization. And so again, I think that's where our three areas of alignment are still very relevant, because you got to have that that organizational wide support to help all levels of the business keep up with that. Yeah, do you want to introduce kind of the different phases of the task automation
Yeah, I think it's
that we
good.
talked through?
Yeah, it's good to do that. We keep alluding to this paper that sort of gave us or planted the seed for us to sort of think about developing this framework again. And we'll put it in the link, to the show notes at the bottom here. But the title of the paper is a model for types and levels of human interaction with automation, and the lead author was Raja Parasuraman. And this was written back in May of 2000. So we went into the Wayback Machine to find inspiration.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, we're saying we need human-led, tech-enabled food safety, and I just, what does that mean, And this was basically that title. It was more on just computer machine, but what is human machine interact? How do you design that system? And I thought it was very fascinating.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, absolutely. And I think you're talking about those levels of automation, and it starts with information acquisition, then goes to information analysis, then to decision selection, and then action implementation. And right, the concept here is that you can automate all four of those, right, in a system. And that level, but the level of automation for each one of those four kind of layers is dependent on each other to some extent, but you decide, right? So you could have a system that's high in information acquisition and analysis, and like it feels like that's kind of where we are right now in terms of some of the AI landscape, to me anyways.
Hmm.
And then we sort of progress into the decision selection piece, right? Systems that make recommendations to the human, or sorry, the human in the loop, right? Like you're suggesting, here's two courses of action you might take. So you were just talking about how people are using Copilot, right? So I think that's probably a good example of that. We're taking Copilot's getting the information, or people are feeding it in from an analytical standpoint, and then getting recommendations coming out of that system. Now it's the action implementation piece, right? That's where you get to sort of full automation, right? And what's the human in the loop there, and what role do people play? Or do we kind of just turn the keys over and say, go with it, run the system? We'll step back. And I know of a certain age, right? When you're a kid growing up, you always watch Fantasia, and there's the classic kind of Mickey Mouse with the dancing brooms, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's sort of when action implementation goes wrong, right? Like, they just keep dumping the water in the well, right? Like, but that's essentially what we're talking about, right? So you've lost control, and I think that's the concern, that most people have when you talk about AI, is that it's the unintended consequences, or what we talk about in, I think the industry speak, is an alignment problem, like between intent and action. So, I appreciate what you said about individuals being able to think about and even use the framework that we've developed, maybe absent organizational buy-in, and not even necessarily for the purposes of scoring, am I mature enough? Do I have enough? But again, just sort of thinking about the questions that you should ask, and how those questions can inform your particular use case, even if you're one person sitting at a desk. And it's like, where are the guardrails, like, and kind of where do I want them to be? And usually I find I get to those guardrails by sort of asking questions like, what am I comfortable with? Have I thought about this? So I like that part of the paper, that we kind of framed it and kind of borrowed that really, I think, good idea just to help, people frame their thinking as they approach it. But thoughts from you? I mean, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think we specifically focused on the first part of this paper from 2000 on designing human centered automated systems. And the first step, again, we focused on was like, how can we help food organizations identify where automation fits, and are you ready for that? Where this paper continues, the 2000 paper, Parasumaran paper continues, is then, okay, once you've identified where you need automation and potentially the extent of automation you're comfortable with, then you start to implement or integrate evaluation criteria and those kind of unintended consequences, and you focus on identifying those and managing those. And this is a cyclical process, right? So it's not like we're going to go roll something out, set it and forget it, right? Modeling in general is a very iterative process, right? As we continue to get new information, we feed that back in, we improve how the system's working. And so I think the design aspect as well can be iterative. And the next phase where this food safe AI framework drops off is kind of what you're speaking to. Okay, let's say I have my problem. I'm got business support for this year and budget. I've got the IT team. We've done some preliminary integration of data sets. We've looked at the quality of that data. We understand the security of the data. Okay, we've got the IT. Okay, and we're a mature food safety organization that's looking for ways that we can be more proactive and preventive. We're interested in new insights and new signal. Okay, we've got all those now. Okay, what extent of automation and what are the potential risks and what are the both the human consequences, but also the kind of business in a regulatory space, business risks, public health risks, right? What are those risks and how do we approach those? And so I think again, that's not included in where we are at now, but I think that's where you're alluding to, is like, that's kind of what's next. That's still what we're hearing from companies. And, those are, I think, great conversations that are happening in those food safety conferences right now. There was, at least on the drug manufacturing side, a recent warning letter that came out. I'm sure maybe you saw it as well, like for the first time, mentioning on an inappropriate use of AI in that operation. And it was exactly that broom kind of automating itself. It was, no oversight. Okay, we use some tool to develop our SOPs, our plan, and we actually didn't know the contents of it. So we weren't implementing what we said we were doing, and what we said we were going to be doing wasn't even the appropriate, right, control in place. And right. And so FDA is saying that's an inappropriate use. You need to be, but you are still the owner of your documentation and your data, and you are owner of that, even if you're using these tools to document it and come up with it. So I think that is kind of the next phase that we're coming into. If you I think you're nodding your head. You've heard maybe some similar.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good call out, right? And it gets to that again, sort of thinking about what's your use case and what's the problem you're trying to solve. And I think, to your point, if somebody steps back and uses, a framework like this to begin with, and I think that this is where the sort of inherent tension is for me right now, is that, there's such a kind of pressure, or these tools are widely available when we kind of think about LLMs, right? And you can really, it's like magic, right? You can ask it anything you want. And so there was some research that came out of the Wharton School at Penn State just in February of this year that looked at the concept of cognitive surrender, right? Like, and in that case, and we can link to that in the show notes as well as the warning letter, which I think was a cosmetic manufacturer. But when the researchers in that study designed a LLM that would randomly give people the wrong answer, right? And then they would ask people to assess, do they believe it or not? The correct answer when it was given, or the wrong answer when it was given. And I think it was about 93% of the time participants were willing to accept the right answer from the system. and 80% of the time they're willing to accept the wrong answer from the system. So that's only a 13% difference. And that still means that 8 out of 10 times people are willing to sort of take what's given to
Mm-hmm.
them, right? And I think that is that tension between, you know, technology that exists that provides us with the opportunity to ostensibly be more productive, at least in theory, but may lead you to the complete wrong place. Or you lack that inherent expertise to understand that what it's giving you is in fact inadequate. And yeah, I will say, we have seen more of that recently. Ourselves, just in the work that we do. I mean, these are tools
Mm-hmm.
that are out there. People are using them, and they should,
Yeah.
right? You should familiarize yourself, I think, with what these things can and can't do. And that's where, I think again, food safety is a small sliver of sort of the overall applications that these technologies are brought to bear. We're talking about it through that lens and that context. But again, being kind of that regulated industry, and one in which, you know, billions of servings a day, right, of food that go out, like the way that we build and maintain these systems is important from a public health standpoint. And so the appropriate sort of use of this technology and people understanding its strengths and limitations is important, right? And I think that's really kind of what drew us to write that paper in the first place.
Yeah, I
And
think that's still where, like what you were saying, that's still maybe where people at. They're going to use it as a starting point, right? And then maybe they
right.
come to you and say, okay, now let's involve an expert, review what we are proposing, or review what we're planning, work together on, finalizing or implementing, or um, really, really moving forward from it, using it as a starting jumping off point as opposed to the end.
Yes, right, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of it's your roadmap, right? Like you're planning your trip. Like I'm going to use this framework to say, okay, where might I go and how might I get there? But take the time to do the planning and not just jump in the car and, drive off into the sunset. I mean, sometimes they can be fine, but in the context of food safety, like maybe planning it out is a good idea.
Yeah.
So when we look around the corner, things like HACCP, right? That requires your HACCP plan requires validation and continuous verification, where you've got a CCP or food safety plan where you have that preventive control. Like, how do you see validating some of these deep learning models that where you can't see reasoning, or agentic AI, where you have agents going out and functioning either on, a validated data layer, but still making interpretations, or just, you know, interpreting the data themselves? Like, what should we be thinking about, in terms of validation? Or do we have to really wait until we get to like fully explainable AI? And will we ever get there? I know those are kind of maybe questions that
Yeah,
you,
I don't know if I have all the
yeah,
answers, but
exactly.
I think a few thoughts. Right. I think what maybe we've seen or we're starting to see is an idea that you would run kind of the non-AI path and the AI path in parallel, right? And that's kind of your first step, and see kind of the differences, whether this is considered, validation, what extent of, what level of confidence or what level of accuracy is acceptable. I think that's still kind of hanging out there as, 100% accuracy is probably not practical or achievable with most levels of investment that we're probably going to put towards these kinds of projects. But running them in parallel to understand where are the differences, how is it working, how is it performing, and then understanding maybe, yeah, what are the checkpoints, right? So we can run this for so and so however long, and periodically we're going to monitor, right? Monitor and check and ballot and do that verification of, okay, we did the non-AI path as well, and see how far off we're at and kind of fine tune. So I feel like that's still kind of what I'm hearing and seeing about how some of these are implemented. I don't know if that tracks with maybe what you're hearing or
Yeah, I think especially in the agentic space, sort of how are those agents built? Sort of what data are they acting on? Yeah, how do you
so
create?
yeah, maybe for the agentic side, right? I think at the enterprise level, you can kind of scope it to your information, your data, right? So, or you can say search the whole web, and I think that's maybe another um, kind of segment of. I mean, you can train it on your specific documents and data and workflows and conversations. Um, and try to avoid some of the other hallucination. I mean, it doesn't perfectly get that away, but at least it's scoping what it's pulling from to your information, and assuming that's all based on what we know, latest food safety science and all of that. Then okay, maybe that is an appropriate guardrail. But yeah, some of the other use cases maybe in agentic is maybe not so easy to do the what is the checkpoint, what is the human non-AI route versus AI route. I'm not sure if maybe that use case tracks.
Yeah, I think the upside is that food safety people understand kind of that concept of validation and verification.
Yeah,
Maybe more so than other industry segments where some of this where there are similar use cases. So I think there's more work to be done in that space, and exploring, both from an industry and
definitely.
regulatory standpoint. So that to me is kind of one of the spaces to watch over the next few years and think about, yeah, what does good look like, and how do we know the systems are functioning the way that they should, especially in the absence of maybe more direct human oversight. So
Yeah, and I know you and I are both involved a lot in traceability space these days, and I keep pointing towards FDA as being a good example and maybe source of maybe current thinking or direction of the regulatory thinking, right? So they've been pretty transparent about how they're using um, AI and machine learning for inspections of imported products, right? They're trying to work towards a new model of facility inspections in general that's more data driven. So they are also applying these tools as the regulators. And then a lot of on the traceability side, right, we're seeing some frequently asked questions or answers to questions around, can I use algorithms, um, to supply lot codes, for example, or how accurate does with the volume of products that I'm moving, it's impractical to think that I'm going to have 100% accuracy of my data all the time. What's the appropriate level of accuracy of data in my system if you ask me to provide all of this data? And I think those are really, I don't think there's been a clear answer, right? Oh, well, we aim for 100%, but we understand that there might be errors, and we would expect that if you identify the error, then you address it. And maybe that's the same workflow that we're already familiar with, like a corrective action. So I think like you're saying, I think that's an area to watch. And maybe there's not a clean answer, but yeah, there's different scenarios that will come up and be kind of exemplary of where we kind of go, and what we're aiming for.
so as we kind of move to the end of our conversation here, for somebody that's listening today, maybe a food safety professional who wants to go back to their organization the next morning, Monday morning, next week, whenever this is, and use the framework, from your perspective, like what's one of the smallest useful actions they could take for to start off?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's just a discussion with the leader, like one on one, or if it's a group activity to come together, like everyone come together and try to fill out the questionnaire. I think we intended it to be used around a problem, so you could kind of think through, because some of the questions are related to data, And so maybe the data that you have will be specific to that problem. But yeah, I think we want people to just start using it, give us feedback. What did we miss? What was difficult to answer? What was unclear? So maybe current food safety projects that they have on their radar, try it out and let us know, yeah, how it goes, and whether it's, a small team, or maybe just introduce it to the leader, have the leader try to think through and answer it, and then discuss it more broadly. But I think try it out is maybe pretty basic, and let us know.
Yeah, no, we definitely want that feedback. And, I think where that can be valuable, like you said, is just sort of expectation setting, right? It's like, oh, wait, here's the data that we actually have, but we don't have any data over in this space, or it's all, paper based. So we're going to have to scan it in and OCR it and all this, so I think it's just even understanding that landscape and doing some kind of baselining in terms of like, you want us to go out and find AI. Well, we can, but sort of here's the army we have today, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if we want to mature and sort of think about other ways to use this, we may need to make some additional investments here in this space foundationally, in addition to what we might be looking at. So yeah, I think the intent was right to give people sort of a mirror that they can hold up and say, right, like,
Exactly.
here's where we are. Like, and it's not that there's a right or wrong answer, but just, if people reflect honestly, that it gives them a spot to say, okay, here's some gaps that we might want to close or think about as we move along in this journey.
Right. I
So
think we did a good job of like not just spitting out, okay, here's a summary of the, high, medium, low, but some opportunity recommendations for, okay, if you're low in this area, what would it take to get to the medium? What would it take to get to high? And then again, taking that back to team set, whatever else you have going on, not saying that this needs to be um, perfect. You don't need to be perfect. You can implement different stages of these of AI as you're maturing, but just I think giving you, as you said, like a roadmap or kind of that plan, something a little bit maybe more tangible to chip away at and show progress, to those leaders who are pushing for adoption.
absolutely. So Claire, final question. Who or what in food safety or outside of it's doing work right now that you think deserves more attention?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. um, what would I answer? I still, I think we talked about a lot about validation, of when AI goes wrong and goes rogue. But I still am really interested in, some of the work that maybe now is a few years back, but coming out of the AI Institute for Next Gen Food Systems, that's out of UC Davis, right? This article from Carrie Alexander around liability law policy incentivizing adoption of predictive AI. So, not as much about when AI is not trustworthy, but when it is, right? And this maybe comes back to, okay, if we can prove that this is helping us identify more risks, and then like addressing those risks would improve public health, then if we aren't using these, right, is that also something to consider? And how do we incentivize then adoption? So I think it's a little bit more on the legal policy, regulatory compliance, like side, which is definitely adjacent to maybe the food safety professionals and their team. But yeah, interested in that kind of idea, and incorporating that into some of the conversations around validation and where this fits in a regulated space, and if there, maybe are some creative, I guess, creative legal ways to encourage use of them, of course, responsibly. But and then the other area, maybe outside of food safety, that I have been looking at recently is a recent paper on the um, over-complexification in global food systems. Right. So kind of the idea that we feel like we need to just keep adding more and more. It's like we're not doing enough in food safety. And so we need to, but I think there is, the idea, the FDA blueprint of smarter food safety, not work harder, work smarter, like still trying to think of what that means. And this paper, actually out of a couple of folks from Canada, University of Guelph, is around indicators of complexity and over-complexification in global food systems. And this idea, including AI and data as an addition to the food system, is that, are we at the threshold where it's just pushing us over the point where, yeah, it might be adding some value, but it's not giving us a return on investment. The impact isn't there. And instead we should think about, innovation by subtraction, or innovation by removing complexity. And I think that's interesting when talking about which problems we're trying to solve, or where does this fit? Where could we remove complexity in a food safety program? So yeah, just a couple of interesting kind of papers and examples that I've been reading up on.
No, it's great. It's a great call out. And I think a couple of podcasts ago, I think talked to one of your PhD advisors, Martin Weedman, about,
Okay.
he'd recently published one on, his paper sort of around risk, risk management. Are we overly worried about some
Sure.
things?
Yeah. Same idea.
We shouldn't be. Right. End of the day, wash your hands, right? When we look at the burden of foodborne illness, right?
Right.
It's mostly viral, and it mostly,
right. Time, temperature, and washing clean, still thinking like, let's not overcomplicate the basics if we're still not good at the basics.
right. Yeah. We want to chase agentic AI when we should just be washing our hands. So there you go. That's your takeaway from this podcast. Wash your hands.
Yeah. I mean, of course I could say the work that's coming out of Cornell, but that would be a given, right? I think I'm
biased,
so
yeah.
right? Biased,
Positively
sure.
biased, of course.
No, there's a lot of exciting stuff, I think, happening in a lot of food science departments, and yeah, there's just a lot of energy around this, which is good. I think it's all good. It's all pushing us to think about food safety in different ways, and hit those boundaries where we're like, okay, yeah, this isn't a good use, this isn't appropriate, or this is not helpful. So I think all the work that's going on
Yeah.
is
No,
great.
we'll include a link to the UC Davis paper in the show notes as well. I think that's an
Yeah,
interesting one. When you look at there's some parallels there for me in terms of whole genome sequencing, right? And sort of a reluctance, and where are the incentives to use that? And I think we're early days in terms of AI, but it's essentially, it's the other side of the knife, right? That cuts both ways. Is you create these systems and they tell you things that you wouldn't have otherwise known, that then create liability. And that's not necessarily a bad thing from a public health standpoint, but have you thought through kind of what those outcomes could look like? Not dissimilar too from just product testing. Whenever we're advising clients
yes,
on product
yeah,
testing, I always ask them before they test, what are you going to do with the result?
exactly.
So have thought through that before you collect the sample and do the test, because you have to ask yourself, well, why am I taking the test in the first place? So
Right. And I think that's kind of a summary of what we're talking about with that food safety majority and agility, right?
right.
Agility is like, how quickly can you change?
Yep.
So I think that's kind of spot on, and that's a really good parallel of whole genome sequencing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to end. Claire, thank you. For listeners, the Food Safe AI framework, it's an macro Excel tool. We'll link to it in the show notes, as well as the food protection trend paper. And, as Claire said, if you're listening and want to try it in your own organization or just independently, do that. Send us feedback. We love that. That's how it gets better. I'm Ben Miller, and this has been Tag Talks. Thanks.